Thank you. Very interesting discussion so far. John McNaught from GHD. I had a question for Percy around local government that resonated quite strongly with myself. I'm from Gippsland, and I guess in Gippsland we have the 6 councils that have a thing called the GLGN, which is sort of their coordination group. But I was interested in terms of how you would actually go about implementing such a model. If you took Gippsland as a region, for example, would you see it as that size region that you would have a shared services model, or are you thinking of it as the current amalgamated councils, aggregating those back to their sort of town areas as local government areas, or are you thinking it broader, like a statewide shared services arrangement, or can you expand on that a bit further?
Yes, there are different models. I'm more familiar with New South Wales than other states, but I'm aware that you had major amalgamations in Victoria, and Queensland's now had them. Even where there are large councils, shared service centres can work. They work within very large corporations, even internationally. So the area it covers really depends on the sort of economies of scale you might get. So it can vary. It can vary a great deal, but they have been shown to work. In other cases, you can just outsource it, like rate collections could be outsourced to electricity retailers or water retailers. There's no reason why it has to go to a dedicated centre. There are economies to be obtained in doing that.
Thank you. Jane Reynolds Foundation 1901. Can I start by thanking CEDA, Australia Post, Gippsland and Advisian for the support of such a report and getting this started. We need to have this discussion. Struck by the reality that we're spending quite a bit of time referencing the people of Australia, but not actually talking to them yet. And that's happened through the white paper process as we've seen it so far. Can I make a statement? Federation Week, annually in the week that includes the 24th of October, recognising Henry Parkes' Tenterfield oration as the speech that captured the imagination of the Australian people. The Prime Minister's commemorative address in Tenterfield on Saturday, he stated that Parkes had launched the Federation and that was right for his times. He called on us to relaunch the Federation tonight in a way that was right for these times. The Prime Minister also suggested a 5-year time frame. My question for you is, I absolutely support the Prime Minister's initiative, but might we need an insurance policy on that? And if I could briefly explain. The BCA reform needs to be owned by our people. Stephen, your op-ed also looked for best outcomes when we engage people. These reforms are critical. Clearly, we're hoping to achieve them through agreements by government. But if that's not the case, or if it takes longer than 5 years, can politicians ever trust us to engage in the debate and perhaps through an opportunity of a national discussion once a year on federation?
Who's going to take the punt on this one? Good for you, Ian, wouldn't it, this one?
I'm not a politician, so I can answer it. I'm not a politician. Look, is 5 years long enough or not? I just make a couple of things. Think about 5 years. That's 2 elections in the federal sphere, and gosh knows how many elections in the states. In 5 years, you'll have 5 budgets at Commonwealth level and 5 at state level. In 5 years, you'll have 5 more G20 meetings, 5 more this, that's and the other things. I think there's 2 reasons why 5 years has to be long enough. One is simply that the scope for, if this is to be a central part of our discussion as a nation, the scope for it getting distracted, sidetracked and whatever grows the longer you try and maintain it. So if we can't do it in 5 years, then I think we'll be talking about something else anyway. That's the problem. Secondly, all discussions have to have momentum. In politics and anywhere else. At the moment, we have a sense of momentum. We have discussions now, we have white paper, We're going to have a Commonwealth election where the federal government will take its proposals to the electorate. We'll have intensive discussions with the states in the next second two-thirds of next year. We'll then have, the white paper, and we'll then have, probably in the lead up to the 2016 federal election, intense discussions with the electorate. I don't think we can, and then you'll have 3 years to implement whatever you get out of an election. I don't think we can last any longer than that. So I think the momentum would just fade. And I think we've got to acknowledge that if we don't do it in the next, I'm not sure we have 5 years, I'd say if we don't do it in the next 3 years, we're not going to do it. And if we don't do it, then we either better do what we can out of it, and that's, hopefully it's not all or nothing. I don't believe it is all or nothing. Do what we can out of it to improve the Federation, because whatever we don't do in the next 3 or 5 years, I think we're then back to a 15-year period of nothing, because governments and populations don't continually revisit the same subject. So I think we've got to make 5 years enough. But I would be actually, as a prudent bureaucrat, having a 3-year timetable, not a 5. But the scope for slippage.
Question down here.
Thank you. Cheryl Saunders, Melbourne Law School. Can I just make a quick observation on Tanya's very interesting remarks and ask if she has any views? I agree with you that the idea of a functional separation of roles and responsibilities is something that needs consideration in the context of this important debate. And there are federations elsewhere in the world that we can look at to see how that operates, Germany being the most obvious example. But in the Australian context, given our history so far, it seems to me that we'd need to look at two things in particular. One is how we can remove the idea that if functions are separated in that way, the states are therefore accountable to the Commonwealth for performance rather than being accountable to their own constituencies, which I think should be an important goal of this entire exercise. And secondly, insofar as the intergovernmental machinery would remain important, in fact, arguably be even more important under that model, how would we make that more transparent, more accountable, and more responsive also to the views of the community at large?
Thanks, Cheryl. On accountability, I think it's still possible to have quite direct accountability at their respective levels. So if, for example, you do say that states are responsible for service delivery, notwithstanding the fact that there might be a shared responsibility at the policy level, you can still, it's going to be a challenge to explain this to the electorate, but I think you can still, certainly from a governance point of view, be very clear where the buck stops in terms of delivery in that example versus the broad policy architecture. So I think accountability can still be more clearly defined through that clear delineation and allocation of roles within a particular responsibility area. In terms of the machinery, though, you raise a really good point, I think, particularly around the shared space. So if you do end up with a situation which I imagine would happen a lot, particularly in terms of policy roles, where there is a shared role between the states and the Commonwealth, I think we do need new ways of defining that and making that much more explicit and transparent, as you say. So when we talk about a shared role, policy role, what that translates into is a kind of a variation of a terms of reference or terms of engagement, which is, what is this layer of government bringing to the table, what is their particular niche within that policy space or their value add within that policy space that we want to access and leverage in these arrangements, and what are the other parties similarly bringing to the table. That needs to be sort of fully articulated and captured in some kind of governance mechanism that is explicit and more transparent.
Is here one question here?
Baden Firth with Mitsubishi Australia. Just picking up on something that Dr. Watt mentioned just now around the election cycles. Is it perhaps an issue that needs to be addressed, that the endless churn of elections in this country and the misalignment of that cycle from state to council to the federal elections is actually causing that, a lot of this misalignment around the policy and the framework, federal framework?
Reforming the federation's hard enough. Reforming the electoral cycle strikes me as impossible. I can't see in my lifetime the Commonwealth moving away from a 3-year election. The problem is the Senate, it's 8 years for senators. No one can defend that and no one will defend that. The best thing the Commonwealth has done and done consistently for a while is got out of the fad of double dissolutions. You think of, for various reasons, we haven't had one for a very long period of time. So at least we've basically run 3 years, which has been a big improvement. As for aligning, an alignment of elections between Commonwealth and state, it is not in the interest of either Commonwealth or state politicians to do that. Full stop. Because as the Commonwealth, you want to run against the states, and as the states, you want to run against the Commonwealth. Sorry.
Question over here.
Andrew Tung, Victorian Department of Premier and Cabinet. Ian, if our objective at the start of this is no overall increase in the tax burden, and probably for reasons of international competitiveness, a decrease in the tax burden, actually that's a statement, given the cost pressures we face, about redesigning public services. It's not actually a comment about who does what. It's actually how do we redesign public services so that we're not paying as much tax, or we don't increase the tax burden, but people pay in other ways. When do you think the community is likely to cotton on to the fact that that's the conversation we're really happening? And what do you think their reaction will be when they realise that?
Andrew, the first point you make is, I think, a very good one. The Commonwealth certainly isn't interested in increasing tax as a share of GDP coming out of this exercise. Now, at the end of the day, that share is going to move around, but it certainly means that there is no significant change from our point of view. And it'll move around not because of decisions of governments, but because of economic growth, basically. So that means there is no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for either Commonwealth or state or local government. It does mean that we're certainly going to have to try and get more efficiency out of our existing arrangements, our existing tax bases. Doesn't mean we can't significantly change our tax bases. I'm not suggesting that. But it does mean we need to get more out of existing tax bases and more of our existing services bases. If we get an improved split in roles and responsibilities, we should be able to get some of that in terms of better outcomes. I believe that. And I believe it not just because of what politicians tend to focus on is the overlap, duplication, waste. I tend to think that the weakness of our system at the moment is that no one is planning for the system as a whole. And a good example is our health system. We plan for our bits, you plan for your bits. Sometimes they intersect remarkably well, given that we do it differently. That's where I think we'll get the greatest benefits. But yes, at the end of the day, if you don't increase tax as a share of GDP, if you don't have remarkable growth, yes, we're all going to have to find cheaper ways of delivering the services we currently do. Have citizens cottoned on to that? No, but it's coming. It's coming regardless of federation or federalism reform. Really is. That's going to be, I think that's one of the greatest challenges to the Commonwealth government. And I think it's an even greater challenge for the states because you have a much bigger service delivery role than we do. And no one's cottoned on.
Thank you. There's a question over here.
Yeah. Just in terms of increasing tax revenue, how do you have that conversation when the public is questioning the corporate ethics, for example? What may be technically legal in terms of tax shifting all over the world is seen to be morally questionable, and this issue's come up not because of corporations or government, but because the public is saying this is unfair when, you know, you've got James Hardie paying no tax, Google paying a modicum of tax, IKEA. I mean, might be smart business, and we might need the business, in terms of being our comparative advantage in terms of making places attractive for business to invest. Nevertheless, hard to have the conversation in that environment.
Yeah, I actually think it's a conversation that governments have been very much involved in for a very long period of time. This goes back to the work that's been done in the OECD over a decade or more about corporate taxation and the ability to shift profits around. And through the G20, now the OECD's done some great work on this, through the G20 that is gradually starting to be implemented, and we'll see a further step in that journey in Brisbane if everything goes according to plan. It currently seems to be. I hope it stays that way. So it is something government's been very conscious of. Now, we're not going to stop, we will never completely eliminate the ability of firms to conduct activities in low tax areas and get a low tax benefit. That's perfectly legit. We should be able to significantly cut back on the amount of profit shifting that's completely arbitrary. And that's what we're trying to do. And so I actually think this is a conversation that's well underway. And it's essential. I mean, for every government in the Western world, it is absolutely essential, because the corporate tax base is going to vanish on us if we don't do it. That's galvanised governments.
Question down here.
Nathan Taylor, CEDA Chief Economist. I have a confession to make. Having pre-read the report, I would like to ask you a question from one of the papers in that. Today we've heard from a range of presentations on changes to the Federation. In his piece on that very issue, Ken Wiltshire describes how you can do that without necessarily changing the Constitution. However, it requires all the clocks to strike 12 at the same time. We've talked about some of the ambitions here today in terms of reforming the Federation. My question to you is, how can we ensure the clocks do strike 12?
I'm sorry,
To all the panel members, how can we actually introduce reform into the Federation?
Brad, do you want to answer that?
I'll go first. This sort of also comes back to that question that Hannah just asked too about the tax base. I'm actually quite passionate about linking outcomes to payments. Now, I know that's not practical at an aggregate level because you've got lots of things which can't be directly allocated to particular services that are delivered. But I do think that it's been clearly demonstrated around the world, and I just gave one example, but there are lots of examples. London congestion charge, that started with a very poor support base and now has a very high support base because the money is funneled from that congestion tax into investments in public transport. The more transparent you make the tax to the outcome to which the revenue raise is dedicated, the greater the support you get. That's an easy way of bringing, ticking one box, I would have thought. Clearly there's another debate going on at the corporate level with the G20 to see that you can take a global approach to profit shifting so that you actually have companies, you're squeezing the places they can go to. And I see that just this week that the ATO has now got access to Swiss bank accounts, which I think has been a problem for many years. So there are a number of stars starting to align now, but if we come back to the first question, which is how long can you do this in, I do believe you've got to strike while the iron's hot. There is momentum building now. While the momentum builds, that is your highest and best chance of ticking all those boxes, because then you can get community support. Everyone will be tired of the debate in 3 years' time, but if they get involved in it now and they see that there's going to be some restructuring to the tax base so that there's a fair allocation of the way monies are raised and then used, and if they also see that other people are paying their fair share, you'll get more momentum. And once you get momentum, then you'll get outcomes.
If I could add a thought. John Cotter, who's he's a professor at Harvard who's spent his life studying change management and reform and looked at thousands of case studies. His sad conclusion is that nearly all reform comes through crises, not through opportunities. And so if this debate is simply about exploiting opportunities, which I think in this room we can all see, I don't really think the public at large will go with us. I think this is going to be posed, notwithstanding what Ian Watt said about the system not being broken. I think it is going to have to be posed as federalism, unless it's reformed, will be broken. And a picture's going to have to be painted of the future of Australia if we don't fix it. We've already heard that health, aged care and pensions and the like are growing far faster than GDP, and we will have to either raise taxes or we're going to have to cut other things. And I don't think the Australian public at large really understand that. And so I think it does need to be couched in terms of the future of Australia. We can either move towards an unsustainable public sector by running bigger and bigger deficits, as happened in parts of Europe, and we know that consequence, or we can cut the safety nets. And so the question for Australians is, are you prepared to pay for this? And if you're going to pay for it, who's going to be responsible for it? And it comes back to the hypothecation issues. If you're going to pay for something, you want to see value for money in that area. So I think this has to be a fairly stark presentation to the Australian people that it's not just about opportunities, which we can see in this room. It's really about averting a crisis, and if we don't fix it now, we'll just drift into a crisis, and it will get reformed, but it'll be after a crisis, not before it.
I'll just come in on at an earlier point. I think it's important, obviously, to get the wider public on side, but the first barrier to cross is getting all the states and territories on side. And I think the key thing there's a lot of things obviously that are going to be at stake, but the key thing is getting the proposals around governance right. And by governance, I mean giving states and territories comfort that they've got a role in shaping the agenda and really focusing the agenda of COAG on some goals that are genuinely shared. And it's also about ensuring that the associated governance mechanisms allow for fair power sharing and shared also monitoring of outcomes. So I think for me the one thing to get right is the governance, and to give states and territories comfort to then sign up to the range of reforms that then need to get put to the people.
Thank you. Question down here.
Thank you very much. My name's Karen Batt. I'm the State and Federal Secretary for the Community and Public Sector Union, looking after state government employees across the country. I have to say I'm somewhat concerned about some of the focus of the presentations today and of the papers in the document. There's a voice not being heard in this debate, and that is the staff that work for governments of all tiers. They deliver very, very high quality services. They're professional people. And some of the comments that Andrew Tongue has made and the responses from the panel have raised alarm bells with me and my colleagues here today that there seems to be an agenda running about the future direction of service delivery, whether it be through the use of shared services models, whether it be the use through the voucher system that the NDIS is operating under, or any other of the things coming out of Cameron's England, such as social impact bonds or public service mutuals. My concern would be that part of the dialogue you need to have is not just with the interest groups, the governments and other people, but also with the staff that work for governments. They have a very, very clear view about what's the problem, what would be the solution, and they should be part of any discussion about the new federation. And I'd ask that CEDA consider involving them and their unions in part of this discussion.
Well, we'll make that the final question, but I've got one little statement to make. And I have 3 children who were Gen Ys, and when my grandparents, who I will call Gen 3s and Gen 4s because they were 3rd and 4th generation, they were Gen Ys back when Federation happened. I would ask, how is CEDA, and you can make a comment if you like, how are we going to implement this? My son went to the last election and was given a green ballot paper, and he thought he was voting for the Greens. So how are we going to educate the young ones on the relevance of politics? Because to them, taxation and politics is really, they don't like paying tax and they don't understand politics. They don't understand government. So how is CEDA going to take this forward to bring those groups who are the future of this 21st century, like my grandparents were of the previous century? How is CEDA going to bring that forward? So
that is a very good question. I mean, one of the big issues, I've got children of a similar age, is that there's almost a disenfranchisement going on now. They don't see the value of a democracy. And I think that is, to me, a very concerning proposition, not quite on point to what we're talking about today. But to me, the fact that our children don't understand the value of a democracy is a particularly concerning development.
And I'd like to close the panel session there, and I'd like to invite Tracy Gosling, the Director for State Government with Australia Post, to move a vote of thanks to our speakers.